It's October 23rd here in Seoul, and I'm Kim Dami. We begin with these stories making the headlines at this hour. Starting with North Korea's military support for Russia. According to Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelenskyy, North Korea is preparing 2 military brigades of 6,000 soldiers each to support Russia. He says the North is backing Russia's policy because of money. U.S. Secretary of State Antony Blinken met with Israeli leaders as part of Washington's latest push for a ceasefire in Gaza, while Israel confirmed it killed potential Hezbollah successor Hashim Safiuddin in an airstrike 3 weeks ago. The International Monetary Fund expects South Korea's economy to grow 2.5% this year and 2.2% next year, the same as its forecast in July. The world economy is expected to expand by 3.2% by the end of the year. North Korea is preparing 2 brigades of 6,000 soldiers each, Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelenskyy says, while the U.S. claims it's still analyzing reports of a North Korean troop deployment to Russia. Lee Seung-jae has more.
Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelenskyy says military intelligence has information pointing to North Korea forming 2 brigades of North Korean soldiers, with each unit consisting of 6,000 troops. The Ukrainian leader added that while the troop deployment poses a challenge for Ukraine, its military knows how to respond to it, stressing that it's crucial that its allies do not shy away from the recent developments. Zelenskyy went on to express his gratitude to all the countries that have condemned Pyongyang for its military support for Russia, emphasizing that the world is interested in ending the war and not prolonging it. He further called on the international community to stop Russia and who he called its accomplices. Meanwhile, Washington says the process is still underway to verify reports of North Korea's deployment of troops. According to the U.S. State Department's deputy spokesperson Vedant Patel, the U.S. has its own processes in place and its own assessments that it needs to make before making any public comments. He stressed that the lack of confirmation on Seoul's intel regarding the North Korean troop deployment is not a reflection of its lack of confidence. When asked if any discussions are taking place over what measures would be taken in response to Pyongyang's troop deployment, Patel did not comment. However, the spokesperson stressed that if the reports are true, the regime's troop support for Russia would be incredibly dangerous. Lee Seung-jae, Arirang News.
And the South Korean government has avowed an action plan based on the scale of North Korean support of Russia's war efforts, which could include considering supplying weapons to Ukraine. Our top office correspondent Kim Do-yeon reports.
A quote, military collusion is what the presidential office called North Korea's deployment of troops to support Russia's invasion of Ukraine, while calling for an immediate halt and the retrieval of forces. This came on Tuesday as the National Security Council held a standing committee meeting to discuss potential responses.
The government will implement phased response measures according to the progress of military cooperation between Russia and North Korea following North Korea's dispatch of combat troops. In this process, we will closely coordinate with our allies and friendly nations to ensure that strong and effective measures are taken against the Russia-North Korea military cooperation.
While the top office opted not to specify what the responses would be, as revealing them could impact future cooperation between Russia and North Korea, an official told reporters that responses could be through diplomacy, economic retaliations, or even military action. The official also said weapons supply could be an option. So far, non-lethal weapons have been supplied to Ukraine by South Korea, but the government will reconsider. It will first consider supplying defensive weapons, but if the situation escalates further, it will consider offensive weapons. The top office also called out North Korea for neglecting its own people, calling it a criminal organization.
Meanwhile, attendees of the meeting pointed out that the North Korean regime, which has completely ignored the livelihoods and human rights of its people while focusing solely on nuclear missile development, is now driving young North Koreans into a senseless war of mercenaries for Russia. This, we noted, is an act of admitting that the regime is a criminal organization.
In the meantime, South Korea is the only country to confirm North Korea's deployment of troops for Russia, other than Ukraine, with President Volodymyr Zelenskyy saying so himself. A top office official says that the intel was a result of gathering and sharing with the nation's allies and friendly nations like the U.S. and Ukraine over an extended period of time. Therefore, the current stance taken by the U.S., who has much to consider before confirming this, is unrelated to the objectivity of the intelligence. In fact, confirmation should follow soon. In addition, the official said that it's not clear how the deployment will impact the front lines in Ukraine, as there are many factors that will play into it. And South Korea currently is diplomatically calling for the retrieval of troops before it gets to the front lines and to stop the cooperation at this stage. Kim Do-yeon, Arirang News.
Now, will Pyongyang listen to and comply with Seoul's diplomatic call for it to call back its troops? If not, what next? For more, we're joined by Professor Joel Atkinson. Good to have you back, Professor.
Yeah, thank you. It's good to be here.
So the South Korean government urging North Korea to immediately withdraw its troops from Russia. The question is, will the regime listen?
Well, I think the chances of them listening are probably, close to zero. Assuming the media reports are accurate, this deployment is the result of a long, complicated, and very expensive process. So neither Moscow nor Pyongyang would have begun unless they plan to see it through. So I don't think there's much Seoul can say or do in the short term that will change that.
Then what could be the next step for South Korea to take when North actually decides to keep its soldiers in Russia, or even, decides to bring more in to Russia?
Well, we've already seen step one, which is calling in the Russian ambassador, publicizing communication with partners, coordinating condemnations and issuing warnings. So the next step, I guess, would be to send officials to Europe and likely even Ukraine for discussions.
Well, the presidential office said that it could also consider supplying weapons to Ukraine. Now, what does this really mean? I mean, how seriously is South Korea taking the situation at the moment?
Yeah, well, I think Seoul takes this very seriously. North Korea is providing something very valuable to Russia. 12,000 disciplined troops at a time when Putin wants to do anything to avoid mobilizing Russian conscripts. So obviously, North Korea will almost certainly be receiving something of comparable value in return. So that would include cash and nuclear and missile-related technology, all of which are UN Security Council sanctioned violations and a direct threat to South Korean security. And so we have anonymous officials telling journalists that Seoul will escalate up a ladder of options if the deployment continues, starting with non-lethal aid, then perhaps ratcheting up to defensive weapons and even offensive weapons. However, I'm actually pretty skeptical that will happen. To start with, Seoul has shown it doesn't want to make Moscow too angry.
Right.
And also, let's face it, weapons are expensive, and it probably doesn't make sense for South Korea to be taking on a substantial burden of arming Ukraine precisely at a time when this deployment is making North Korea even more of a threat.
Right, it is going to be definitely a hard decision to make for South Korea as well. Now, Seoul and NATO are also following the speculation very closely. Now, they are going to continue to do so through intel sharing. What kind of intel sharing? I mean, what kind of tighter cooperation can we expect from the two sides?
Yeah, so I think this is an area where there really will be a lot of cooperation. I expect Seoul is in the process of dispatching intelligence officers and even military personnel to liaise with the Ukrainians and to share information about what the North Koreans are likely to do and what they are doing in terms of their operations and battlefield tactics. And, South Korean officials could even participate in the interrogation of North Korean prisoners or in psychological warfare operations to encourage them to defect or surrender. They could help translate what the North Koreans are saying in their battlefield communications and so on.
Well, like my colleague Kim Do-yeon just reported, the U.S. says South Korea is the only country to confirm this speculation, and the U.S. is still assessing this speculation. Why is it taking this much time to do so for Washington?
Yes, the NATO Secretary General said that the official position is that they cannot confirm the reports, but that might change. So we have Ukraine saying it, and we have the South Korean government saying it, and more evidence of North Korean soldiers in Russia showing up on social media, but the US and Europe still not confirming it. Why they haven't is an interesting question. There was an Estonian member of the European Parliament saying it was basically an excuse, so they didn't have to do anything. That could be part of it. But there's also a psychological aspect to this, affecting perceptions of how the war may unfold for Ukraine, or even as pressure for what the US and others to get more involved than they want to. And, it could also be they want to leave the door open to dialogue with North Korea or Russia, give them room to walk this back. And it may never be officially confirmed. But I expect the Yoon administration is now asking them to hurry up and confirm it. So we'll just have to wait and see if that happens.
Well, Professor Atkinson, then what kind of reaction can we expect from the U.S. other than, calling it a grave concern?
Well, I think it's hard to really see what more the U.S. could do in Ukraine politically. So I expect it's going to be South Korea really leading efforts to try to encourage a greater response from the US. I think that probably the action will be in Europe, because they themselves are the one who are experiencing or who face this direct problem from North Korea's contribution to Ukraine.
Right.
So I think that's where the action will be, where if Europe is willing to really step up their support for Ukraine in response to this deployment.
Alrighty, thanks so much for joining us this morning. We appreciate your insight.
Yeah, my pleasure. Thank you.
And the South Korean government, a military, is remaining vigilant with an annual large-scale drill taking place involving a combined river crossing exercise with the U.S. Our defense correspondent Kim Bo-kyung has this report.
After the smoke screen is set up, K-21 armored vehicles cross the river one by one. This is the part of Korea and the United States combined river crossing exercise as part of the annual large-scale military Hoguk drill. The exercise began its 3-week run since on Sunday, aiming to enhance the combat capabilities and joint forces interoperability against North Korea's threats. Considering the geographical features of having lots of streams and rivers on the peninsula, river crossings are essential. And thus, as part of large-scale field training exercise, 1,000 soldiers from battalions of ROK Army's 7th Maneuver Corps, along with the 2nd Infantry Division ROK U.S. Combined Forces, took part in combined wet gap crossing training exercises.
A contested wet gap crossing is one of the hardest operations to execute in land warfare. To execute it together, as we did, with our same soldiers sharing our equipment, to span the gap that neither of us could span on our own, is an outstanding demonstration of the strength and commitment of the ROK-US alliance.
One notable amphibious bridging vehicle that has been self-produced by Korea is the KM-3 that had its inaugural deployment in June. This is the first time this KM-3, or Suryong, roughly translated to water dragon in English, has been deployed in the real river crossing drill.
I'm currently riding on a KM-3 amphibious bridging vehicle. This vehicle can turn into a bridge, allowing troops and other vehicles, such as tanks, to swiftly cross rivers.
The KM-3, a Korean version of Germany's M3 amphibious rig, has been developed by Hanwha Aerospace and can carry equipment weighing up to 60 tons. Not only does it reduce the installation time by up to 70%, but also operational personnel by up to 80%.
The time for setup takes much less for the existing RBS, the ribbon bridge system. It can be deployed within 10 minutes, and only 3, the 1/6 of the personnel, is required to set up. It thus enables quicker and more stable support for river crossing operations.
The Hoguk defense drill will go on until November 8th. Kim Bo-kyung, Arirang News, Yeoju.
Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu held talks with U.S. Secretary of State Antony Blinken on Tuesday to discuss post-war plans for the Gaza Strip. According to the Prime Minister's office, the Israeli leader noted that the killing of Hamas leader Yahya Sinwar will have a positive impact on the return of hostages, the achievement of war goals, and post-war plans. Netanyahu thanked the U.S. for its support against the so-called axis of resistance, while Blinken urged Netanyahu to capitalize on the death of Sinwar and end the conflict in Gaza. The U.S. envoy also called on Israel to improve humanitarian assistance for Gaza. Now, also on Tuesday, the Israeli military confirmed the death of a top Hezbollah leader. Hashim Safieddine was reportedly killed in an airstrike earlier this month, shortly after an Israeli assault killed Hezbollah's longtime leader, Hassan Nasrallah, in September. The IMF kept its forecast for South Korea's economic growth at 2.5% for this year, while also maintaining the projection for the global economy at 3.2%. Inflation has been mostly defeated around the world, according to the IMF. Our Shin Ha-young has the details.
The International Monetary Fund on Tuesday maintained its outlook for South Korea's economic growth at 2.5% for this year. This outlook is on par with its July forecast when it raised the projection due to the country's faster-than-expected growth in the first quarter, driven by strong exports. October's projection aligns with the OECD's expectations and is lower than the anticipated growth set by the South Korean government of 2.6%. The IMF expects South Korea's economy to grow by 2.2% next year, unchanged from its July forecast, but did not provide further details on the reasons. As for other nations, the IMF raised its growth forecast for the United States by 0.2 percentage points to 2.8% this year on the back of rising consumer spending. But Japan's growth was downgraded to 0.3% from July's projection of 0.7%. The growth outlook for China was cut to 4.8% due to weakness in the real estate sector and low consumer confidence. And the Eurozone's growth forecast was lower to 0.8%. Regarding the global outlook for this year, the IMF kept it steady at 3.2% but lowered its projection for next year to 3.2%, 0.1 percentage points down from its July forecast. The IMF gave a positive assessment of the global fight against inflation.
The battle against inflation is almost won. After peaking at 9.4% year-on-year in the third quarter of 2022, we now project headline inflation will fall to 3.5% by the end of next year.
However, the IMF warned that downside risks to the global economy have increased since July. Key concerns include escalating regional conflicts, particularly in the Middle East, which could pose serious risks for commodity markets. It also noted that maintaining a tight monetary policy for too long could abruptly worsen global financial conditions. It emphasized that central banks should adopt a cautious and flexible approach to monetary policy, considering inflation, growth, and employment conditions. Shin Ha-young, Arirang News.
Now, let's take a look at the stories from around the world with our Kim Xiang. Good morning, Xiang.
Good morning, Dami.
Let's start with the ongoing BRICS summit in Russia. Russian President Vladimir Putin is in Kazan to welcome his counterparts, isn't he?
Yes, that's right, Dami. The 16th BRICS summit is underway in the Russian Republic of Tatarstan. Now, the Russian President Vladimir Putin greeted world leaders in Kazan on Tuesday, where Russia is hosting 36 countries and some 20 heads of state to encourage cooperation to challenge the Western-dominated world order. At the opening of the summit, Chinese President Xi Jinping held a sideline meeting with Putin, where he spoke of a profound friendship between Russia and China amid a chaotic international situation with profound changes unseen in a century. Putin greeted Xi by calling him a dear friend and said that Moscow and Beijing will work towards creating a fair world order. The two agreed to a no-limits partnership in 2022, just a few weeks before Russia invaded Ukraine, while they have already met twice this year. Putin also spoke with Indian Prime Minister Narendra Modi and South African President Cyril Ramaphosa on Tuesday, as part of some 20 bilateral meetings scheduled on the sidelines of the BRICS summit. The European Parliament voted on Tuesday to approve a plan to use frozen Russian central bank assets to provide Ukraine with a loan of up to 35 billion euros. European Union lawmakers voted by 518 in favour to 56 against, alongside 61 abstentions, to give its ally Ukraine some $38 billion in loans, a voting procedure to confirm the plan agreed by EU governments earlier in October. The G7 aims to loan up to $50 billion in support of Ukraine, with that money coming from profits generated by Russian assets frozen in the West since Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine in February 2022. Currently, some $230 billion of Russian assets remain frozen across the European Union. Now, these account for over two-thirds of the Russian central bank's foreign assets. South Korean global car maker Hyundai Motor's Indian branch set a new record as the largest IPO in India's history on Tuesday after the launch of a $3.3 billion landmark initial public offering in the country's financial capital, Mumbai. The stock was listed at 1,934 rupees, or $23 on the National Stock Exchange, slightly below the offer price of 1,960 rupees, or $23.31. The company, however, saw its stock price slip 7.2% by the end of trading on Tuesday, which valued the company at some $17.6 billion. Now, Hyundai is India's second largest car maker, with a market share of around 15%. The former CEO of fashion brand Abercrombie and Fitch, Jeffries, was arrested on Tuesday and criminally charged with sex trafficking and prostitution involving dozens of men. His 61-year-old partner Matthew Smith and James Jacobson, who allegedly recruited men for the couple, were also arrested. Now, 80-year-old Jeffries, who built Abercrombie and Fitch into a popular clothing brand with sexually charged marketing, was charged with 1 count of sex trafficking and 15 counts of interstate prostitution, involving 15 unnamed victims between 2008 and 2015. The other defendants face the same charges and, if convicted, would serve a mandatory minimum 15-year prison terms, with a maximum of life sentences for the sex trafficking charges and 20 years for the interstate prostitution charges.
It's Sanggang today, the last autumn seasonal term. Autumn certainly feels like it's passing much faster this year with frequent rainfall. It was a very chilly and windy morning commute for most of us, and please brace for an even chillier start for tomorrow. But temperatures would jump right back to above season norms in the afternoon. And until this morning, more rain is in the forecast for central parts of Korea, Jeollabuk-do province. The amount will not be much, but Gangwon-do province could see 5 to 20 millimeters of rainfall. Then skies will get sunnier for rain-affected regions. Meanwhile, southern provinces will be sunny for most of the day. Busan topping out at 22 degrees. Seoul and Chuncheon only make it to 16 degrees this afternoon. Now, it looks like we are going to have the chilliest morning of the season tomorrow, with a low of 7 degrees in the capital, with much brighter skies in the forecast through the weekend. Well, that's Korea for you, and here's a look at the international weather conditions.
That's all we have for our morning edition of Arirang News. We'll be back tomorrow at the same time, 10 a.m. Korea time.